And moderating this panel today is going to be Dr. Nick Lutze from the International Council for Clean Transportation, ICCT. He is the Program Director for Fuels, Marine, Heavy-Duty Trucks, and Aviation. He has co-authored 18 peer-reviewed journal articles and dozens of reports on technology potential, regulatory design, industry compliance, and cost effectiveness for vehicles and alternative fuels. Previously, with the California Air Resources Board, he participated in the regulatory development and technical analysis toward the 2004 and 2012 adoption of greenhouse gas emission regulations for automobiles. He received his BS in Agricultural and Biological Engineering from Cornell University and his PhD in Transportation Technology and Policy from the University of California at Davis. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Nick Lutze.
All right. Thank you, Penny. That's greatly appreciated. That introduction is great, and thank you so much for the city of Kaohsiung, the AIT, U.S. EPA, EPA Taiwan. Everybody has been so warm in welcoming us and creating just this fantastic venue for a dialogue on these very important issues. I think it's all been great for me. It's been great for everybody involved, and I just want to say I think I've learned so much already, and I've met so many important actors in this arena, and I look forward to more of the same today and tomorrow. For this session, we'll focus on best practices in approaches, policies, and technologies to clean up ports, clean up ship activities. We'll get into questions of the environmental consequences of ships and port activities, which are so important to economic development, but have these side effects that we have to look at and address in some way, related to emissions, related to fuel use, and these in turn have effects on human health, air quality, and climate change. For this session, I'll first give a presentation of my own to provide a little bit of context for our session, and after that I will ask our just fantastic lineup of several individuals to hit on a couple different areas where best practices, where we have examples of best practices that I think will be very helpful for the dialogue here that haven't quite come up yet through the last day and a half. I'll ask that group of speakers to come up, and they will give their thoughts. And in the meantime, I would request that everybody along the way, just as has been done through the last day and a half, please jot down any questions. Think of any questions you have to make sure that as we finish up on all the presentations, that we continue a dialogue and make sure there's a lot of back and forth on some of these issues that are very difficult at ports and for the shipping industry. Let's see. So I'll go ahead and get started then with my slides. I think let's see. Just to start out, we've heard here it's a very challenging and a very exciting time for the marine industry and for port activities. That there's a lot going on, and there are a lot of challenges. And there is a huge amount of pressure from society on the maritime industry and on ports in so many different ways. At the same time, ports and shipping is heavily involved and is a key part of economic development, of moving economies forward, but at the same time, it is an increasingly large part of our air quality issues and our climate change issues. So this is all part of this immense challenge for the industry moving forward, is how do we have it in all ways at the same time: economic growth, the transport that is necessary to do what we want to do in this world, while at the same time having less emissions, less energy attached to all of that behavior. So to introduce this session, I did want to give a little bit of a broader transportation context. The broader transportation context includes the transportation sector and a whole variety of different subsectors within transportation, not just the shipping and marine area. And I did want to have a little bit of that context because I think it's relevant, and I think it helps us to think a little bit bigger and see what we've learned in other subsectors of transportation and see if that helps us in any way in our thinking. So for the slides here today, first I'll just provide a little bit of background. I'll provide a handful of examples related to actions to reduce shipping emissions, and I'll just provide a couple of conclusions before I hand it over to our speakers. So a little bit of background on the International Council on Clean Transportation to segue us into marine. Our work at the ICCT is mainly focused on the largest markets for transportation. The figure that is shown here and the map showing proportionally the countries that have the largest amount of auto sales. This is representative of overall activity related to transportation. And as you can see in the distorted map, China, the European Union, and the United States have sort of a disproportionate, outsized impact in terms of vehicle sales, and of course that ripples through all economic activity as well as the maritime industry. And with this spread of all of the different countries and regions and the amount of energy use, the amount of emissions across all these different markets, comes responsibility to look at the environmental consequences. And just as background, at this point, almost every major market for vehicles has some form of major policy that brings down the emissions of those vehicles. Almost entirely, there's this set or progression of policies that comes into place in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and increasingly all in the other countries around the world, that goes from having light-duty policies that would bring sulfur out of fuel, light-duty policies that would clean up the tailpipe emissions of those vehicles, and then light-duty CO2 standards that would either be addressing carbon dioxide or fuel economy. And we're seeing that same progression go from light-duty to heavy-duty to various forms of freight that start to get at some of the equipment that we've been discussing in the last day and a half, including inland vessels, cargo handling equipment that also can benefit from low sulfur fuels, and increasingly we're getting policies in ocean-going vessels as well. So I wanted to provide that for context because as we see more emissions policies to bring down emissions in all of the other sectors in transportation, planners in cities and regulators at a policy level are getting pressure to look at everything that can be done across transportation sector, and marine becomes the next most important area, generally speaking, after light-duty automobiles and heavy-duty freight have been addressed in some manner with new policies. This figure just shows a very basic trend based on IMO, International Maritime Organization data and projections for how maritime activity will require more fuel use over time. We could see increases in maritime activity that would increase fuel use and carbon dioxide by a factor of 2 or by a factor of 3 within the next 3, 4, 5 decades. These are projections. There are many, many different factors involved with that. I just wanted to show a general trend that today the marine sector is about 10%, plus or minus several percent based on what countries you're in, the amount of bunker fuel versus all of transportation activity as a whole. And increasingly, as we see more efficient light-duty and heavy-duty vehicles, the marine sector becomes that much more important. And even more important than that, the marine sector NOx, SOx, and particulate matter can be 10 to 40% of mobile source emissions. We're only starting to see inventories that have much more rigor to say what exactly is going on from port activities, ocean-going vessels, inland vessels, to better inform those kind of numbers. But we're starting to see the importance of marine within the overall transportation sector has to be included in any major planning efforts that look at all the emissions within the transport sector. I have this table here that we put together at the ICCT as we were thinking about a couple of our workshops and activities that are ongoing in the marine sector. And I think it's a great fit for how the conversations have evolved throughout the day and yesterday, that we've started to talk about ways that ports and ships are cleaning up their and lowering their emissions, but there are many different approaches to that. There can be voluntary approaches, there can be incentives that push voluntary one step further, there can be more heavy-handed policy or regulatory approaches as well. And this table just tries to lay out what we do know about the advantages of voluntary versus more regulatory policy approaches. I think a lot of these points have been hit on. I just wanted to use this table to summarize some of the major relative advantages when we think of voluntary and regulatory approaches. In voluntary, we can get quicker actions, we can get local actions that are most appropriate to the local needs. We can use these voluntary and more locally based projects to better understand what the data, what the true impacts of any of these policies might be, and they could provide the experience we need to make a more serious policy that might require enforcement or wider use of whatever that voluntary action was in the first place. And regulatory, of course, have their own sets of advantages to them. There's increased certainty about what actually happens. There is a more uniform approach. Of course, the marine industry craves, like any other industry, a certain amount of certainty and uniform regulatory framework across the world or across the places that they do business. This is not a marine-specific request or demand to try and bring forth cleaner technologies. This is true anywhere. The more uniform a set of policies can be, the better it is for having more systematic actions from industry so that investments can be much more focused. So investments can be planned in a more systematic way in a competitive global market. Just to give some sense for some of the examples that are relevant here for the marine sector, these voluntary and regulatory approaches, I won't get into it too much, only to mention a lot of these have come up already in various ways on the voluntary side. We've heard a lot about just great activities all over at different ports. And we're seeing fuel switching efforts. We heard about the Fairwind Charter. We will hear from my colleague Frida Fong later within this session about the last two items mentioned, and they relate to incentives through there are many methods to try and assess what a good incentive is for different actions. The incentive tool is one approach, and operational port improvements. We heard a great talk from Richard earlier today about many different institutional capacity issues to make sure port activities are well aligned and systematically steering a port towards a better comprehensive plan to reduce emissions. And that was great, and I think the air quality toolbox that's been developed by the Starcrest group is one such tool to help along in that way. And I will discuss in the next few slides a couple of the more major regulatory approaches that get at CO2 emissions, that get at the NOx emissions, SOx and PM, with new requirements as well as low sulfur fuel. So just to mention some of the policies, I don't think this would be new information to many people in the room, but just to mention that there are a set of very major regulations that are in play in the shipping industry. They relate to, at the IMO, at the International Maritime Organization, the MARPOL Annex 6 standards that address NOx, SOx, and PM emissions, and increasingly are also looking at carbon dioxide emissions through energy efficiency design index standards, as well as the SEMP standards as well on in-use operational efficiency. This is the trend to look at air quality related emissions and then move toward carbon dioxide emissions that relate to global climate change. We're seeing a variety of not just those international policies, we're seeing a cluster also of regional and national policy. We've heard a little bit about some California policies, we've heard some about U.S. policies. There's also European-related regulatory work moving toward cleaner emissions on ships. And increasingly we're seeing standards that address inland shipping and off-road and non-road equipment. And so I think all of these are relevant here for the overall movement toward cleaner ports. Let's see. At present, the idea of emission control areas is an extremely important policy and an extremely important concept, really, to reduce emissions from the maritime sector. This impacts anyone in the maritime sector in terms of the fuel sulfur content, having direct emission benefits, but also enabling cleaner technologies on board vessels and on board any vehicles that utilize that fuel. And so that's important for SOx and for NOx and for particulate matter. This is a map I took from another agency, and I only use it to say there's a huge amount of uncertainty whether there will be emission control areas that go beyond the North America ECA that exists today and the North Sea and Baltic ECAs that exist today. Where ECAs might go in the future is highly uncertain, and as we heard a little bit earlier yesterday from Dennis at the EPA, there's a lot involved in that process, and I think everybody in the U.S. That was involved in the petition to get the North American ECA was very proud of the effort because it will have very dramatic positive impacts all across the United States and across North America in terms of the reductions in SOx, NOx, and particulate matter. But as we've heard, I think we've seen yesterday a couple slides related to what the impacts from marine emissions on human health are. We've seen from Civic Exchange, we've seen from Dr. Corbett's work, we've seen the human health impacts can be very dramatic all around the world, and a lot of that relates to the sulfur dioxide and particulate matter emissions that occur in many places that are very heavily populated that are not in major emission control area zones. Just one slide using EPA data. I think probably one of the most underappreciated policies in the United States is from the emission control area for North America. This table, I won't go through the numbers in it, but I think the very important point is each one of the columns in this table represents a very major rulemaking for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The first two relate to light-duty vehicles, so automobiles, the Tier 2 standards, would utilize lower sulfur fuels to bring down the NOx emissions, the hydrocarbon emissions, by approximately 85 to 90%. These are major rulemakings with major benefits. The heavy-duty rulemaking was a state-of-the-art standard as well that pushed NOx and particulate matter emissions much, much lower for all of the heavy-duty vehicles that provide most of the freight within the United States. A major, major rulemaking, a huge success, a large benefit to cost ratio. But I contrast those two with the marine ECA. The marine ECA actually has greater benefits and a greater benefit to cost ratio than those much more prominent first moves in light-duty and heavy-duty emissions. So I wanted to say how important it was. I think Dennis of EPA made great points yesterday related to U.S. EPA's work toward the ECA, but I think we could go much further. This was a huge success, and it will provide huge benefits for 10, 20, and 30 years from now in the United States and through North America in terms of monetized benefits to human health and all of those benefits greatly, greatly overwhelm the initial technology costs related to the fuel and technology in the marine industry. And let's see, just one more note. I think everyone is quite familiar with it. A key part of moving forward in cleaner emissions, at the point I mentioned earlier, lower sulfur fuels have direct benefits. They also have indirect benefits. They allow us to use more advanced, cleaner equipment in our cargo hauling equipment, in our trucks, in our smaller vehicles, all over within the land and on-road and highway fleet, also within ports. Marine fuels have a much higher sulfur content presently, and as we move towards ECA type limits, we start to see lower sulfur emissions. And this is important. I did put in one point that I think was worth noting. Ocean-going vessels are the dominant part of most of the emissions at ports and in port areas. And so when we think about the air basin that a port is involved in, it's impossible not to think about ocean-going vessels as a major piece of any solutions to cleaning up overall ship and port activities. And just as a broader point, clean diesel that is used increasingly in U.S., in Europe, and in China, we move toward lower sulfur fuels, and we start to see those lower sulfur fuels in the on-road fleet, and increasingly we'll start to see those at ports and off the highway, and increasingly in ships. And switching from air quality and conventional pollutants to carbon dioxide, I wanted to make just a point or two related to carbon dioxide. I think as policy moves from cleaning up our air to addressing climate change issues, we've heard a little bit about it already. We've heard about the great efforts from the Maersk Line to reduce the carbon dioxide within their ships. And this projection in the red line is business as usual. We see ships getting lower carbon dioxide emissions per ton kilometer or per ton mile, and those improvements are great. We have new policies from the IMO that further increase efficiency and reduce the carbon dioxide emissions, and then we have the potential to go much further. The in-use practices with vessel speed reduction, potentially going further with alternative fuels like LNG in the much longer term, can have even greater potential than what we're seeing so far. And the great news about a lot of the carbon dioxide emission technologies that are available is that a lot of them actually reduce cost. They are increasing efficiency within ship activity, and many of them have net benefits overall, that the fuel savings would actually be greater than the initial cost of the technology. I won't go into it, but if anyone is familiar with the marginal abatement curve method, this figure just shows how many options have net below zero cost effectiveness. Therefore, it's showing that the benefits are greater than the cost of bringing forward cleaner, lower CO2 technologies on board our ships. So I think, as I mentioned in the start, this is a very exciting time. This is a very challenging time. The marine sector, port activities are critical in all economic development and in all economic activities. But at the same time, there are immense societal demands to clean up all of our activities, light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, the marine sector, and all of that requires a lot of approaches, a lot of options that some are voluntary, some are incentive-based, some are policy and regulatory to provide an even playing field for industry. All of these are extremely important because we know there are many, many technologies that exist today. We know that there are better practices in operations that we'll hear a little bit more throughout this session. We have improved port management practices that get at the nuts and bolts of how ports are run, and that's a very exciting area, as we've heard from so many different ports in the last day and a half. All of this makes for, I think, a very rich environment for an exchange like this, where sharing of ideas, sharing of how different issues were addressed is critical to us all. And it's an important time for that. So I think with that, I'll conclude my remarks. And at this point, I'll ask that could we please get our speakers to come up. I think we have 3 different panel members that I would like to bring forward here. And if you could all come up and maybe sit on the other side of the stage, that would be great. Let's see. I do want to remind everyone in the audience, please, as you think through all of the presentations that are going to be given, please think through any questions you have. I think we've gone quite far in the last handful of sessions that went through yesterday and today, but I think we can go even much further. I think we can try and understand ways to clean up port activity even more in this session, and make sure to jot down any sort of questions to make sure we have a great dialogue afterwards. But with that, I think our first speaker is Ms. Stephanie Jones-Stebbins, and I've had the pleasure of speaking with her a little bit and understanding her work at the Port of Seattle, and just reading from her bio, she has a very interesting background that I think has only helped her have a great perspective on all things related to management and ports and the environment. Her background in planning and in engineering work and as a Peace Corps volunteer around the world and through the United States has really been great. Her background includes master's work at the University of North Carolina in environmental engineering at Duke University. And I think she has a lot of great things to say about all of the Port of Seattle's efforts, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. Please, a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that kind introduction. And I would also like to first say that it's a great honor to be here. And thank you to the city of Kaohsiung and the Port of Kaohsiung and the Taiwan EPA and the U.S. EPA for organizing this event. I've already learned a tremendous amount, and I look forward to learning even more. So I am going to talk a little bit about global practices and opportunity in sustainable goods movement. Specifically, what I was asked to speak about is spreading best practices, and just a couple things to consider as I give my presentation that I just like to start with putting in your mind. Best practices are most powerful when more ports align, and I believe that's ports on both ends of the supply chain. We've done a great job collaborating among ports in the Puget Sound and in LA on the West Coast, and we're beginning to collaborate more across both sides of the ocean, and I think that's critical. I think more efficient resource use can be a competitive advantage as well as an environmental benefit. Shippers are beginning to look at supply chain carbon footprint. As we heard this morning from Maersk, they're maybe not willing to pay for it, but they are thinking about it and asking about it, so that's a good start. Forums to share information are very important, as we know from being here, and the collaboration has really been key to helping Puget Sound ports implement best practices. So first a little about where, just put Seattle in context. Seattle is up there on the right part of the screen. Do I have a... there we are. Seattle. There is Seattle. As you can see, we're in the northwest part of the U.S. And this shows what Port of Seattle trading partners are. So you could see some of our major trading partners. Some interesting differences, actually, from the Port of Oakland. But some similarities as well. So you can see who we trade with. This is an aerial photo of Seattle. So a couple things that are of great importance here. This is our main cargo port area, and so you can see our central downtown area is right here. You can possibly see that there are two major stadiums here. There's residential areas right along here, and again to the south. So we are right next to our downtown, and our not only can our citizens see everything that's happening at the port, but they're breathing the air where we are emitting. So it makes it critical for us to reduce our emissions and to be very conscious of that. A couple other, just to orient you, our major container terminals are Terminal 18 Terminal 5, Terminal 6, Terminal 46, and Terminal 30. We have the major rail yards here and here and right here. So our major rail yards are not on terminal, but they're very close to our terminals as well. We have 3 cruise berths at the Port of Seattle. Pier 66, which is right in the heart of downtown, and Pier 91, where we have 2 cruise terminals at the north end of the harbor. We also have a bulk grain facility. Our cruise business continues to grow. Last year was a record year. We moved just under 2 million containers last year, which was close to a record year, but not quite. As I talk about how the Port of Seattle has looked at implementing sustainable best practices, we've really felt it's important to look at 2 things. To look holistically at the whole supply chain, and then to look at each point on the supply chain. And these practices spread best, or go viral, as we say, when the community is expecting them and demanding them, and their expectations are met. One thing we've seen in the U.S. is that as ports in one place implement a best practice, the citizens near ports in another place will say, I want you to do that as well. So that's really been a key factor in best practices spreading around the U.S. It's not always, we don't always welcome it at ports when our citizens say, hey, do what they're doing too, but it has been a very powerful impetus for spreading environmental best practices. It's been really key to have stakeholders involved, not only our business stakeholders, but also the community stakeholders. Not only so they can understand impacts better and what constraints are for the ports, but also so that we can understand better what truly are the concerns of the community. And when these environmental improvements are made in a way that works with the business and actually can benefit businesses, they are much more sustainable from a business perspective. The first thing I'd like to talk about, looking holistically at the supply chain, is a study that the Port of Seattle did a few years ago called the Carbon Footprint Study, Asia to North America. A couple years ago, I'd say before the economic downturn, we began to hear shippers caring about something other than cost when they decided to ship their goods, and that thing was carbon footprint. But what we heard was that, as we've seen from a number of presentations, we know that vessels are much more efficient than other modes of transportation. So we were hearing shippers beginning to think, we know vessels are so efficient, it must be a lower carbon footprint to ship our goods but with the longest vessel route. But we weren't sure that was true, and we wanted to evaluate that further. And what we actually found was that we did this. I will tell you what the headline is, and then I'll tell you about the study. What we actually found was that the shipping the shortest line, so if you're going from Asia to the U.S. Midwest, the shortest line is through the U.S. West Coast, and that has a significantly lower carbon footprint. So as shippers begin to care about the carbon footprint of their supply chain, that will matter. So what our study did was look at this number of different ports of origin in Asia: Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Ho Chi Minh, Busan, and Tokyo. And we looked at a number of different destination cities in the U.S.: Chicago, Columbus, Memphis, New York, Atlanta, and Norfolk. And then we looked at all the different ways you could route your cargo between those cities and analyze the carbon footprint. So we looked at ports of entry for Seattle, Oakland, Los Angeles, Prince Rupert, Savannah, New York, Norfolk, and Houston. We looked through going through the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal. And looked at many different factors, including the different vessel sizes, vessel design speed versus slow steaming, different levels of vessel utilization. So we really looked at all the different complexities many, I won't say all because there are probably innumerable complexities, but many of the different complexities that you have when moving cargo. And what we found was that there is a West Coast advantage moving between, it's not moving between anywhere in the world, but moving between these two specific locations, Asia and the U.S. Midwest. Much lower carbon footprint to go in the straightest line. So there are between the West Coast ports, there are differences between, for instance, the north part of the U.S. lower carbon footprint to go through the Pacific Northwest, the south part of the U.S. lower carbon footprint to go through the Pacific Southwest. But the differences are relatively small. The biggest difference is between going through the West Coast and going through the Panama Canal, a very significant difference because it's so much further. So just for the example of one 40-foot container going from Shanghai to Columbus, either passing through Seattle or passing through the Panama Canal and then Norfolk, there's a difference of 0.846 metric tons of CO2, and that is just for one FEU. And you can imagine that the ships we saw earlier, 1,800 TEUs in one vessel, so that number does multiply. So this just shows the number of different, this graph shows a number of different origin and destination combinations. So looking at all these different ports of these are the destinations, and the colored vertical lines are the different ports of origin. And you can see on average, the West Coast has a average, I mean, these all are a little bit different, but on average, a much lower carbon emissions to go through the Pacific Northwest versus through the Panama Canal. We now have on our website a carbon calculator, so you could actually look at different ways, if you are a beneficial cargo owner, look at different ways of routing your cargo, put in the where you're coming from, your port of entry, your final destination, the size of vessel, how fast the vessel would move, and understand what the total carbon footprint difference would be for different routings. That website is actually on our that calculator is on our website. So this is a relatively crude tool. It's a first generation, and this is something I think we'll see further refinement and further tools. It doesn't take into account things like the differences in efficiency between different vessels of the same size, for instance. But it's a way of beginning to look at the differences of how your cargo is routed, which can make significant differences. So now that I've talked about the holistic look at the supply chain and routing, I'd like to talk a little bit just about specifically environmental sustainability at ports. And I should start by saying, as my colleague from Port of Tacoma referred to earlier, sustainability is not just about environmental. It's one of three legs. And in fact, environmental sustainability is not just about air quality, but our time is limited today, so I am going to focus my comments there, but this is a recognition that there are many other important things to consider. I'd like to talk about the Northwest Ports Clean Air Strategy, which is a collaboration between Puget Sound and Puget Sound ports. Talk about emissions inventory, which we just recently completed, and a little bit about the importance of combining regulatory and non-regulatory approaches. A number of years ago, we used to think it was either or. And as I think as our programs have evolved, we see that both are very important and they work together in different ways. So first, with the Northwest Ports Clean Air Strategy, this was the first international clean air program. We adopted it in 2008. We're right now in the progress of a major update. In fact, in the last hour, we've received the next draft for our review. So we're hard at work in updating this. It's an agreement between the ports of Seattle, Tacoma, and Vancouver, British Columbia, as well as the U.S. EPA, Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, Environment Canada, and the Washington Department of Ecology, and all critical partners in that. It's a voluntary program because we, for the most part, do not have regulatory authority to set these, but we are in advance of regulations that will, I believe, catch up with this program. Key focuses are on reducing diesel emissions as well as greenhouse gases. So we set targets in a number of key areas, one being ocean-going vessels. So some of the ways that Port of Seattle specifically has met our goals for reducing ocean-going vessel emissions. We have shore power at 2 of our 3 cruise berths. We were the first port in North America to have 2 shore power berths. We also have an incentive program for fuel switching, the At-Berth Clean Fuels Incentive Program. And we have it's a tiered incentive program depending on the amount of fuel that a vessel is using. And the idea is that it should cover about half of the additional cost of using cleaner fuel while the vessels are at berth. We've got, a vessel must use 0.5% sulfur fuel in order to qualify. We have 10 participating lines, and as you can see, we've had 375 vessels that participated last year. And just to put that into context, between the shore power and our at-berth clean fuel program, and we have a requirement that cruise vessels use either plug into shore power or use a certain percentage of fuels. Between those certain percentage of sulfur fuel, between those requirements, 3/4 of the vessels that call at Port of Seattle are doing one of those things. So that's pretty significant participation for voluntary programs. We also are further trying to incentivize our shipping lines that call at the Port of Seattle through recognition programs such as the Green Gateway Partners, where we vessels that do participate in ABC fuels or plug into shore power and demonstrate other environmental stewardship above and beyond what regulations required can be awarded a Green Gateway Partnership, which is a recognition only, not monetary incentive. Our Clean Truck Program has been a very important focus for us. We have, as you can see, we've worked closely with Port of Tacoma on our standards. We have this is our clean truck sticker to get into the Port of Seattle, and Port of Tacoma's clean truck sticker is right here. I didn't necessarily mean for my presentation to show their sticker so well, but there you go. It does. In addition to the needing a sticker to get onto our terminals, and we have amended all of our terminal leases so that a truck to get on our terminals is required to comply with our Clean Truck Program and have this sticker. We also had a grant program to help truckers buy new trucks. It was called the Scraps Program. It was a program where a trucker could bring an old truck in, and they would get a cash bounty for that old truck. That truck would be scrapped, and they could put that money towards buying a new truck. And we are now considering the next phase of a grant program to assist truckers to buy newer, cleaner trucks. And the requirement for the first phase was a 1994 engine or newer. The requirement for our next phase will be 2007 model year engines or newer. Cargo handling equipment. It's also been a key focus of our efforts. We have focused on encouraging new excuse me, I'm just going to go to my notes for a second here. Purchase of new on-road equipment, retrofitting with DMFs and retrofitting with various kinds of devices. And we can see here a couple things. These are RTGs that are actually, we've been actually hoping to get a grant to convert these to hybrid RTGs. And you could see at the rail yard at the Port of Seattle, we do have some our MGs, rail-mounted gantry cranes. Those are actually on the rail yard next to the Port of Seattle, not on a Port of Seattle terminal. But in addition, on our terminals, 58% of our cargo handling equipment has been retrofitted with some kind of aftermarket, with some kind of emission control device. We have seen, I think, because of the economic downturn, there's been less purchasing of new equipment, which we hope to see some emission reductions from. But we will continue on those efforts. So with all these efforts, have they made a difference? We just actually about 5 weeks ago released our Puget Sound Maritime Emissions Inventory. So we've done this twice now. We did an emissions inventory in 2005 and another in 2011. We looked at, and this was not just the Port of Seattle, but, whoops, wrong, sorry. But all of Puget Sound. So a little bit about the results that we have seen since we have implemented these programs. These results are not for just the Port of Seattle. This is for all maritime activity in Puget Sound. So we have seen our emissions go down between 2005 and 2011. So diesel particulate in particular is down 16%. Carbon is down 5%. You see a variety of levels of reduction, but all categories of emissions are down. A little bit about specifically the Port of Seattle. So looking at diesel particulate emissions, in specific, we can see our truck emissions are down 53%. And this is a good example of the importance of both regulatory and non-regulatory approaches. A significant part of that reduction is from federal rules requiring lower sulfur fuel. But in addition, we've seen a lot of that improvement is from fleet turnover that's driven by the clean truck programs that the ports have put into place. We see the 34% reduction in ocean-going emissions while at berth, and we know that a significant part of that was our clean fuels program and our plugging into shore power. So just a perspective of how much of our emissions come from different sources. As has been noted by other presenters, more than 3/4 comes from ocean-going vessels. So when we look at greenhouse gases in the airshed, we could see that our emissions have gone down in most of the categories. They've actually gone up in trucks. So we've seen that diesel's gone down for trucks because the fuel has gotten cleaner, but they're actually traveling more miles. And although the fuel is cleaner, they're actually not more efficient. So that will be a focus going forward. But we've seen greenhouse gas reductions from our other sectors. And it looks quite different, where the emissions come from for greenhouse gases. A much larger share from trucks and a smaller and still a large share from ocean-going vessels, but not quite as dominant. So a little bit about what does this mean in terms of the economics. We know on average that $1 spent reducing diesel particulate matter saves $13 in public health costs. That's an EPA number. So if we actually look at what we've spent over the years, it's just last year on our clean fuel incentive program, we spent about $1 million. So we can estimate that saved us $13 million in public health costs. In terms of the global benefits, another EPA reference that the social cost of carbon ranges from $5 to $65 per ton. So that the routing West Coast versus East Coast that we talked about earlier could save between $4 and $56 per container that travels between between Asia and the U.S. Midwest. And then finally, the efforts we have made to reduce carbon emissions just at Port of Seattle could be between $500,000 and $6.2 million. So those are significant numbers. Just in closing, when we think about best practices and spreading them more broadly, they are, I believe, most powerful when ports align. A good example is fuel incentive programs. Vessels are only going to carry so many kinds of fuel. So if we are incentivizing the same kinds of fuel between different ports, much more effective, I believe, than if we are not coordinated. Certainly helps negate the folks who say some of these things can't be done when we see they're being done at other ports. I do believe shippers are beginning to look at supply chain carbon impacts, and these improvements can be a competitive advantage. And it's much easier for shippers to take them into account when we can have numbers to talk about them and more effectively measure them. Thank you very much.
Great, and thank you, Stephanie. That's really fantastic. That's a great talk, and I think it shows a lot about all the great efforts that are happening at Seattle's port, and I think put in that in context, I think there's been a lot of great work at all the different ports, and hearing the examples there in Seattle is great, and that added new perspective of the carbon footprinting, and potentially that could increasingly become a much more important idea as more climate change related policies take off, and if there's a pricing on carbon. So that was a great new addition to the overall symposium to bring in that concept for us. And I think it was also excellent the way you conveyed the synergistic policy and voluntary impacts that happen with a regulatory approach that can bring in lower sulfur fuels and cleaner technologies, but on top of that, voluntary efforts at the port can help the turnover to really to magnify or at least quicken bringing those impacts home to the ports and to the airshed. So I think that was great as well. So we'll move on. I'll introduce Ms. Frida Fung. She's been a friend and a colleague for several years now as I've worked at the ICCT, and so has she, and her work has spanned many different topics. Her background involves technical consulting work for a variety of different consulting groups and NGOs in the past. Her work with the ICCT has just been excellent in a variety of different areas, touching on light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, and the marine sector. She's handled policy and technical issues extremely well. At this point, she's a senior analyst with the ICCT. She's located in Xiamen, China right now, and her background includes master's degrees in environmental management and economics from Sweden and Hong Kong. And I think she'll take us just one step further then in talking about best practices from shipping and ports, and I think bringing a couple more examples that we haven't quite heard about yet in the last day and a half. So, Frida, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for US EPA, TIA, and Taiwan EPA for inviting us here to talk about, share with you some of the best practices that we summarized here. But I have to say, when I was preparing my talk, I thought that I would go through some of the best practices being used in Europe, in US, and some other countries. But after 2 days of discussion, I think a lot of the things have been covered. So I would just say that I'm just trying to summarize some of them to give you an overview, and also to bring in a little bit about some of the tools that we have been developing so as to help some of the ports that are starting to think about preparing their clean air action plan or preparing their clean air program, so that they have some tools that they can use. This is what we usually use to introduce who is ICCT. Nick has given a very brief overview about who we are, but this is just give you a human face so that you can see. But very briefly, we are a nonprofit research organization located in the U.S. We also have an office in Berlin. We have about 40 research staff right now. But in this picture is actually a group of what we call the council members, who are our advisors, advising us on what we should be focusing on in different regions. So you can see here, it was a meeting that we had just a month ago in India, where we meet with our partners in US, Europe, Japan, not including Japan this time, but Russia, Korea, India, China. That give us a focus, attention, what are the things that we should pay attention to in our future work. And of course, marine is becoming one of the major area that some of the countries really want to start take action to. And I will introduce a little bit more when I go through my slides later. So I will briefly talk a little bit about the background. I will go through that very quickly because many speakers have already covered that, and give some examples about green port practices, covering North America very briefly, Europe, Asia, and then we'll talk about incentive analysis tool for ports that we have developed. So here, many people have already talked about marine emissions is becoming more recognized as one of the major contributors to human health impacts as well as air pollution. But I have also need to caution that some other parts of the world it's not that well recognized. So I think many more research needs to be done to gather data to demonstrate that shipping emissions is important. But as Simon has very nicely presented yesterday, these are the latest inventory that Hong Kong has prepared and show that shipping emissions is a very important source of air pollution for Hong Kong. But I also have to say, like, for example, in China, where my work mainly focus on, Shanghai has also done an inventory, and it has also shown that for Shanghai as the city hosts the biggest port in the world, they also have found that marine emissions, including port activities, account for more than 10% of loss emissions and about 6% of their PM 2.5 emissions, which is not an insignificant sector. But I think overall in many countries that's just need to have more work to be done to better analyze, better understand what's the impact of marine sector in order for them to take the appropriate action to tackle it. So this is a figure that many people use from Jim that I borrowed from Jim Coppert. And I want to mention here is this is a very nice chart showing how the PM 2.5 emissions from ocean-going vessels impact human health. But it hasn't been shown here is another part of the story about inland vessels. We show here is the map of Asia, but as many people you know that inland vessels going through, for example, in China, going through Yangtze River, actually also it has a lot of ships that are very polluting. But this is just a first step that we try to analyze the health impacts of ships. If we get more data, then we can look into the health impacts from other types of vessels, like inland vessels, hovercrafts as well. Before going to the best practices, I think one of the themes that is very common in a lot of the presentation is about challenges in addressing shipping emissions. And here I just want to use this diagram to show a very complicated operational structure of shipping. By itself, that makes it very difficult, very challenging to regulate, to promote sustainability or best practices. Because as you can see here, shipping operators itself has a lot of competition. So ports, shipping companies have very intense competition. So by themselves, we have talked many times during these 2 days about competition actually make it very difficult for you to go beyond what the regulation needs. So incentive is needed to enable some of the shippers to do more than the regulation is required. But then also looking at the regulatory framework, right now IMO set the standards for ships for international ocean-going vessels, but domestic government have their authority to set domestic regulations that would govern the domestic ships. But that needs both of them. If those both can be tightened, then we can get better results, better control of the ship emissions. But right now, IMO, of course, is a very complicated regulatory body. So we can see that for some of the countries like China, they don't really have their own domestic regulations right now for vessels. For inland vessels, they just take IMO regulation, which is a very lenient regulation. So more need to be done at the local government levels. With that, I think I would just quickly summarize what we observed for the practices for the mitigation measures that have been adopted in North America. And many of the speakers have very nicely presented what the ports have done. So I think I would just highlight a few key observations. So first of all, you will see that in North America, there's a lot of multi-port collaborations. It's mainly because of the competition reasons that ports have to collaborate in order for them to work together to do better in improving our quality, improving their sustainability practices, and still become competitive. But I think another important thing, especially for U.S., that I want to highlight is U.S. actually have a very nice framework, a regulatory framework, starting from the Clean Air Act, that actually give local government, give state their responsibility, their obligation that they have to protect human health. And that actually gives a very powerful tool to promote collaboration of different parties, different stakeholders, including ports being recognized as the major emission sources in some of the port regions, to work together with their partners, with their ports, but also together with regulatory agency in different levels, like federal government, state government, district, air quality district, to work together to come up with a program, a plan, so that they can improve their emissions, improve their pollution problem from ports. So this is quite unique in North America, I think, that the Clean Air Act itself actually empower the government as well as empower the port to take action to make improvement in air pollution. But one last point that I also want to make is, as Nick has pointed out previously and Dennis pointed out yesterday, that North America has an ECR that's already been approved, adopted. And not only that, it will promote the use of low sulfur fuel for ocean-going vessels that will require right now to use 1% sulfur diesel, sulfur fuel, but also in 2015 it will go down to 0.1%. This will allow not only just that ECA by itself will require ships will need to use this lower sulfur fuel, but also it will actually encourage the market of lower sulfur fuel being more available in the ECA regions. But for North America ECA, we should also mention that it's not only just for sulfur, it's also having a engine requirement, a NOx requirement, which is the Tier 3 engine standard. And for that, it is important in its way because for the Tier 3 standard, it will require loss emissions control that we will be expecting that will be more of an engine improvement, including maybe the loss scrubber that we talk about today, or maybe the use of the SCR technology. So this is going to drive some technology changes in the ocean-going vessels. We initially want to use the St. Pedro Bay as the example, but I think many people has already talked about it. So I will just go through it very quickly. Port of LA and Port of Long Beach started the Clean Air Action Plan since 2006. And it's a plan that is very comprehensive, as we have heard about. It covers ocean-going vessels, harbor crafts, as well as the trucks and other shoreside emission sources. And the Clean Truck program, I think, is a very significant program that has already helped to move a lot of the trucks and also the technology being adopted in the fleet. And we are trying to also try to consider whether or not we can introduce that kind of best practices in other parts of the world, for example, like in China, because that we can see that this is a very useful program as a lever to introduce cleaner technology into the fleet. Going to Europe, we haven't really had a lot of discussion about Europe, but I think one of the observations that we had from looking into the ports program that has been implemented in Europe, one of the key things is there's a far more emphasis on the voluntary measures. And as we have talked about, there's the environmental ship index that Port of LA has just adopted. For the environmental ship index right now, there's 19 ports that have now signed up as the incentive provider based on the using the environmental ship index. But among those 19 ports, there are about 15 of them are in Europe. So it shows that 15 ports together in Europe that can create a very good collaboration in encouraging ships to improve their operation, improve their engine, and also improve their fuel by trying to get a better ESI score in order to get the incentive. But another observations that we have are a common and increasingly more important mitigation measures that European ports use is the use of LNG ships. So in Europe, just in October this year, 2 months ago, Port of Rotterdam and Port of Gothenburg has just signed an MOU, which allows them to work together in establishing the port facility to have the LNG bunker fuel supply. But they also will work together to set the rules on how to regulate the bunker fuel supply infrastructure. So this will certainly be one of the new development in using a cleaner type of fuel to enable the ships operating in the eco-region in Europe to have another choice, not only just a lower sulfur fuel, but also to utilize the LNG gas. And as we have discussed yesterday, natural gas is becoming more of available sources because of the technology innovation on exploration of shale gas. So with going to be higher oil price, expected higher oil prices, also more available natural gas and tight regulation natural gas, liquefied natural gas ships may become a more common measures for improving ship emissions, and this has already been shown in Europe that that's the real commitment going forward. And for Europe, another unique features of Europe is also that inland shipping is an important, far more important sector in Europe than in the U.S. And in Europe, in 2009, they has started to implement the 10 ppm fuel requirement for not only just for on-road diesel fuel, but also for marine fuel. So for that, it actually enabled ships traveling along inland rivers to use technologies that would that can use 10 ppm sulfur fuel. And we have already seen some of the incentive program being implemented in countries like Germany, that they will provide subsidies for ships to be retrofitted with emission control devices, such as SCR technology or diesel particulate filter, that will substantially reduce NOx emissions and PM emissions from inland vessels. And not only is Germany, but there are some other countries also doing the same. So I think from a perspective, the availability of a lower sulfur fuel, as like the ultra low sulfur fuel, 10 ppm fuel, actually open the technology possibility for adopting very efficient, clean air technology for use in the inland vessels. one example that I want to use here is the Port of Rotterdam. It's very briefly, Port of Rotterdam has the Regional Air Quality Action Program since 2004. And they have covered not only just the vessels, hovercraft, but also heavy-duty truck and off-road. And you can see that for ocean-going vessels, the usual typical measures are being proposed and being used, including shore power, ultra-low sulfur diesel for inland shipping. They also adopt the environmental ship index using the liquefied natural gas, as I just talked about, in collaboration with Port of Gothenburg. And for heavy-duty trucks and off-roads, they encourage better fleet management and modernization of the fleet. But they also have set a modal shift targets for goods being transported by trucks have to go a certain percentage to be transported by locomotive. So this is kind of in the grand plans of encouraging more efficient and better transportation system. And they also encourage electrification of their cargo equipment, cargo handling equipment. Going from Europe then to Asia, we talked a little bit yesterday that Asia in the actually there hasn't been a lot of ports that has already been committed to some very progressive cleaner action plan, but you can see that Asia actually is becoming more of a center of shipping activities. As you can see here, two things that we can conclude from looking at these two figures. One is if you compare the bubbles shows the throughput of the different terminals that we label here. You can see that from 1989 to 2010, in the last 20 years, the throughput that's going through the top 20 terminals in this last 20 years has grown more than 5 times. But more interestingly, you can see that a lot of the shipping activities, because of the change in the global trade pattern, has a lot of shipping activities now concentrated in Asia. And as you may know, that of the top 20 container terminal right now in the world, 13 of them are in Asia, and then 6 of the top 10 container ports are in China, including Hong Kong. So you can see that if we talk about the cleaner action that has been taken for targeting ship emissions, I would say that it's disproportionately less attention being paid to Asia. So because of the importance of the shipping activities, I think more attention needs to be paid and more action needs to be done in improving cleaning up vessels operating along the coast of Asia. One encouraging project that is just started not a long time ago is a sustainable port development project funded by GIZ, the German Development Association. This is a project that is providing capacity building support to 10 ports in the ASEAN countries. And right now, 7 of the 10 ports has already completed the inventory using a streamlined inventory approach, using a lot of the emissions factor that's generated in existing inventory. What they have observed, not surprisingly, similar to other ports, it's the majority of the source of the emissions come from ocean-going vessels. But then another major source of emissions come from truck idling. So a key recommendation coming out from this GIZ project is, first of all, they will encourage use of alternative energy or more efficient equipment on the shore side to reduce emissions from idling, but also to improve the congestion. As many other ports have talked about, they try to improve the truck movement in order to reduce idling. So this is also observed as one of the emissions sources that need to be addressed. And lastly, they also, a very preliminary recommendation is to improve port management, one of which is to improve reduce the sulfur level of the fuel being used by port equipment, by trucks in the ports. In addition to what I show here, the emission inventory work being done by the ASEAN country, right now Shanghai, as I mentioned, that they have already completed the inventory, but Guangdong and Jiangsu, two other major provinces that have major ports in China, are also starting to do some work on ship testing in order for them to enable them to do emission inventory work to better characterize what's the contribution of ships to air pollution. And a latest development, which I haven't really included in the slide, is just last week, Central Government of China has just released a 12-5-year air pollution and control plan. And in there, they specifically required ports to accelerate the establishment of what they call green ports. And they identify several of the ports that we have seen as the top 20 ports in the world. So I would anticipate that that will be work being done in framing how they define as a green port, and as a result, improve the emissions coming out from ships from those very busy ports. So going through what has been done in America, in Europe, and also in Asia, just very quickly go through some of the analysis tools that ICCT we have prepared, we have developed with the goal to help some of the ports or regions that are interested in addressing marine emissions to have some tools that they can utilize to make the informed decision on choosing cost-effective measures to address port emissions. One of which is the ESI. It is basically an incentive tool, a spreadsheet tool that we use ESI as the baseline for estimating what would be the cost and emissions benefits coming out from ships that would meet beyond the ESI requirement. So very briefly, what is ESI? ESI represents a performance of the ship fleet that will reach a certain engine loss requirement, certain sulfur fuel requirement, and also the CO2 performance, which is represented by whether or not they have filled in, they have the documentation of their energy efficient operation practices. The tool that we have done with the help from Starcrest, in addition to use ESI as one of the scenarios that ports can use to look into how much incentive they should give in order to get certain emissions benefits. We also developed the tool in order to look into two other different scenarios. One additional scenario is to look at engine standard plus sulfur plus vessel speed reduction. So they can look at a combination of them in order to look at what's the benefits coming out from providing certain incentive to the ship owners. But we also look at one more scenario, which is only just looking at engine and fuel standard. In addition to providing this tool, we also have just completed a revised version of an air quality toolbox. An air quality toolbox itself identifies a laundry list of mitigation measures that the port can use, not only on the vessels, but also on all the shoreside activities. And the goal for preparing this tool is to enable regulators as well as the port authorities to have the tool and also the laundry list of mitigation measures available for them to make an informed decision. Let me go quickly to look at what are the mitigation measures that we have looked into in the air quality toolbox. Here you can see that we look at the general emissions control technologies that ships can deploy in order to reduce emissions, but not only just for ships, but also other equipment that's used in the ports. So you can see here that's the different types of technology. Also, we look at what kind of application that kind of technology can be used. So we'll lay out whether that's used for trucks, applicable to trucks, cargo handling equipment, marine vessels, as well as locomotive. We also provide a ballpark number for the emissions reduction that could be achieved by those technologies. But lastly, we also try to provide like a preliminary cost number to help the regulator to identify how costly certain technologies would be. 1 point that I want to make here is, if you look at the shore power number, this is a huge range. So I have to say that the numbers that we presented here is actually just really a preliminary number, a very ballpark number. For technologies like shore power, the cost of it really depends on the layout of the ports, infrastructure, existing infrastructure that are already in place. So we try to give just a rough estimate to give an idea to port authority as well as regulators some sense about how costly some of the technologies or options are. In addition to emissions mitigation technologies, we also look at provide the same information for on-engine modification, alternative fuel, as well as some operational strategies. So this is, we are hoping with this air quality toolbox updated with some more updated information that we'll offer it on our website for any regulators and any policy decision makers. Some careful laundry list so that they can choose and try to identify what might be a useful mitigation measures that they can consider to be incorporated into their clean action plan. So finally, just a few conclusions. First of all, shipping emissions is, everybody agree that it has become a more important source of important impacts on human health as well as on air quality. But it is challenging to manage, challenging to control because of a very complicated regulatory structure as operational structure. But we have seen that ports in North America, in Europe, has made significant progress in reducing port emissions. And we have also seen that Asia is trying to catch up. And there's a lots of variety of measures, options for port authority and regulators to choose from to effectively reduce port-related emissions. But inventory development is a very important first step for ports that has not began the action. That's a key tool for them to identify what will be the major source and to design their program accordingly to address the most important part of the emissions. And lastly, there are tools available that will help port authority and regulators to make their informed decision. With that, I will stop here and thank you for your attention.
That's great. Thank you, Frida. That's a fantastic addition here to the session. And just to summarize a couple of points that I think it added a lot of great value to the overall dialogue here. Bringing up the importance of quantification, of using the tools that are available, the analytical efforts to really quantify what's possible, what technologies are available, what sort of benefits they can bring is great. And a couple other small points that you raised I think were interesting related to efforts in Europe and potentially in China that relate to inland vessels. I think inland vessels are not an issue everywhere, but in the places that they are, I think they're important, and there's an important opportunity there with lower sulfur fuels that are increasingly available in places like Europe, like the U.S., like China, because the low sulfur fuel is being rolled out for the sake of the vehicles. Let's see, and those important efforts in Europe, I think that was an added value here for us as well as that one point I think that I just wanted to reemphasize, that China, the idea of bringing into the 12th five-year plan the importance of green ports and the developments along those lines, I think will be very important for a lot of us to watch and see what that means as ports throughout China start to see clean air practices come into play. But with that, I have to hand over to our final speaker, and just to give a little introduction, Dr. Jason CSU is a assistant professor at the National Sun Yat-sen University here in Kaohsiung. He's also the executive secretary of the Center for Water Resources at the university. He has a lot of great and complex modeling and analytical efforts that I can only begin to understand. But I think it's great that they span into tidal research, storms, and in this case we'll get to hear about some of his research getting into optimization of trade routes and using models to predict what's happening in ships and how we can see what happens with any sort of benefits related to, I believe, using the wind to help out a little bit in some cases. I heard a little bit about it at the dinner table last night, so I'm very excited to hear about it. Dr. Yu, welcome.
Thanks, Nick. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to still be here. I'm the last one, so I try not to keep you longer. I think everybody thanks for organizers and a lot of things, but I particularly thanks to Penny and Louis for interesting on my kind of concept, not really complete work. It was just brought up during a lunch session when they were first visiting here, organizing this. I didn't know they are interested on this, so we were just talking, and after 2 months they say, "Oh, I want your talk." So then I have to do something for this. Okay. Anyway, let's start. This is my work. So I'm mainly working on numerical modeling. So the Central Weather Bureau and the Harbor Institute, their operational model are all running by us. So, well, a little bit background. I think you have heard this enough. So a lot of this thing, emission and this fusing, pollution and this thing, you have heard a lot. So, and I just quote something. More than 90% of global trade is carried by sea. And then, so ship emission become a very important part. From IMO report for 2007, 3.3% of global CO2 emission are from this sector, and 2.7% are from international shipping. And that's nearly 900 million tons of CO2. And this can increase to about 18% by 2050. So if we do nothing. And so shipping and CO2, okay, then I quote again from ICS. So although international shipping is the most carbon efficient mode of commercial transport, say, about 30 times more efficient than cargo aviation, and then total emissions are still comparable to those of major national economy. So we need to do something. Okay, so the commitment of IMO is that the consensus of opinion with the global industry that it will be possible for shipping part to reduce CO2 emitted per ton of cargo by 20% between 2005 and 2020. So through a combination of technological and operational developments. So you have heard a lot. So let's have a look about this network. So this is global network, and we have intercontinental and regional links. So you see these big lines. And the most busy part is this Asian traffics. So I just grab a snap view from maritime traffic. You see this Yangtze River Delta, so Shanghai, Ningbo area, and then the Pearl River Delta and Taiwan Strait. So you see how busy this area is. And so talking about this, then navigation efficiency is very important. So a lot of ship owners, they try to do this. This morning, we heard about Maersk has done almost everything, particularly less unit consumption from building these mega ships. So this will be intercontinental then plus regional transfer. And then better fuel efficiency, we also heard a lot during these 2 days. And another thing is optimize cruise speed. optimize cruise speed, I think several people talking about this. So mostly from normal to slow steaming. And then, of course, then probably can go down to minimal coast. This morning, we heard about Kaohsiung probably will implement within 20 nautical miles. You allow only 12 nautical miles. So then, so what will they do? Shipping time is another thing, particularly for merchandise. So another thing is for the operation, also influenced by winds, waves, and currents. So what are we going to do? Maritime efficiency and environment always contradictory, but during this economy recessions, probably something can be different. So usually we can consider ship size versus cruising speed, and fuel consumption versus shipping time, and then cost of fuel versus call frequency, and emission versus environment. Particularly now we are focusing on global economy and climate change. So how are we going to improve our shipping technology? A lot of effort has been done, and pretty alternative fuel, we are happy to hear that LNG is ongoing. And then another thing can be done, and not yet very popular, is improving operation by better adaptation of the weather and sea state. So this is the ocean current around this area. So it's very complicated. So we have the Kuroshio on the east side, and then you have a complicated Chinese coastal current, Taiwan current, and in the South China Sea, you have all these current patterns. But this is persistent but not constant. So how we can adapt our speed or our route using this information. If this is constant, then we can try just to take it, but these are not. So then we have to rely on certain forecasting model to take the variations. So this is our, so since we are doing forecasting modeling, so probably we can have a look on the models first. Can you switch on the, so this is, so yeah. So we have done an operational model for Harbor Institute. This is from today's operation, so this is weather. So you can see the high pressure from Mongolia, and then it's coming down. And you can see this is weather, and the wind is from north and northwest. Okay, next one, please. So from this, then we have tides. So you have this, you can see the whole Western Pacific, the tide situation. And on the left side there, that's indication of the time with the tide variation of Taichung. Next, please. So if you have doubt on the quality, so we set this. So this is automatic operated model, so nobody is operating it. So then we use the online measurement to have a kind of qualification or verification of the model. So you can see the cross are the online measurements, so we can compare, and the user can justify by themselves for the forecast. Next one, please. So this is the current condition on the continental shelf. And the next one, please. And these are the harbors. This is Taichung Harbor. So it's so the harbor operator, they can use this information to for operation. Yes, next one, please. This is Taipei Harbor. So you can see what are the current situations near the harbor. So this is okay. We can switch back. Thank you. That's one part of the operation. Then we have more operation for bigger area. That's the ocean current operation. Yes, this is for Pacific. So you can see the current color represents ocean surface current. And then we have another for this region. So you can see this is just, it's in September, there was a typhoon in Western Pacific, you can see clearly how the typhoon affects. And this is Taiwan, so in Taiwan area, so you can see the complication of the current. So because the vectors is not clear, so you can see clearly from the color, see the current situation. So, and then crucial part, if we zoom in, so you can see even it's persistent, but they have summer and winter patterns. So what are we going to take the advantage of this? So you can see the currents is very strong and very complicated. And also in the South China Sea, the current pattern is also very complicated. You can see September and December, they are all different patterns. And this is in Strait. Strait is strongly influenced by tide. So then you see the tidal currents in that area. Okay, so we made a kind of suggestion. So if we take the route from Singapore to North Asia, we have to pass through South China Sea. Then if we take South China Sea in this time, then we see, oh, sorry. This is, if we take the left, that will be against current. And if we take the right picture, that will be the route following the current. So that will be a suggested route. And then if we take this one, this is a simulation. So if we started from Taichung to Kaohsiung in this coastal area, then left side, that's on the flat, so it's against current. If we take the right picture, that's the simulation on app situation. So you can see clearly that if we take the current, it will be arriving Kaohsiung with the same speed, but probably 1 and even more than 1 hour earlier. So this is just a concept, nothing commercial yet. So if you have any suggestions or comments, you'll be welcome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Yu. That's great. I think that's a nice new addition to the dialogue here. I was excited to hear about it last night, and definitely those models and those maps showing the visualizations about the currents and the tides is very interesting stuff. So that's great. I think we have about 20 minutes here to have some Q&A time. So I think let's follow up in the spirit of the great dialogue we had for the last 2 days here. And I have a couple questions already. I have a couple of my own. I'll make sure to not bias things in favor of my own questions. I have some questions from the audience. Feel free to bring any questions forward if you have any more, though. My first question here from the audience is, it's a general question, and I think it might be best targeted at Stephanie and Frida, but any thoughts anyone has would be great. The question is, we've heard about a lot of the practices that all the different ports are adopting at this point. Of all of these practices, please highlight the ones that might be best adapted and best suited for ports and cities within the Asia-Pacific area, to help provide consistency or certainty for the shipping industry. The thought here would be that they could reduce costs or enhance the adoption of technologies and increase the benefits. My suspicion is that many of them can be adopted, but I was wondering if anyone has any thoughts here. Which ones can be adopted? Which ones cannot be adopted? Maybe some can be adopted more easily. Any thoughts from the panel to help us understand what can we use from our best practices in the U.S. and Europe and bring them to Asia?
Well, I think we've heard of many things that are already happening here. For instance, in Kaohsiung, that are happening at ports on the West Coast would be I think good things to start with. A fuel switch is one, and I was very excited last year to talk with colleagues from Hong Kong about what their plans were, because vessels coming from Asia to the U.S. and back, they're only going to carry so many kinds of fuel. So if we can be incentivizing the same fuels, I think we'll be much more effective. And I think the focus would be on the shipping industry in particular, because I certainly saw other things with respect to heavy-duty vehicles such as trucks that would be applicable, and I think there's many things that I would like to see spread from Asia to the U.S. when it comes to cargo handling equipment efficiency. But since the question seemed to be focused on vessels, I'm going to turn it over to Frida and see if she has.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Stephanie. I think fuel switching or lowering the sulfur level of fuel is going to be a very major measures that could be adopted in the Southeast Asia countries. And I think, for example, in Hong Kong, they are now trying to promote to use lower sulfur fuel, but they also have the challenges of encouraging their neighbors, like Guangdong, to also switch to using lower sulfur fuel. That's a problem if you don't have the regulation that apply to your neighbors, then you have problems with enforcing and regulating it. So that's one thing. But I think, as you mentioned, I think the shoreside emission, I think, is also a very important area that hasn't been really addressed in Southeast Asia. So we have seen for the ASEAN inventory that even the ocean-going vessels is a major source of emissions. I think the lower hanging fruit right now is still trying to better control the emissions coming from the shoreside, simply because they either haven't really got their own domestic vessel standard for hovercraft, and the OGV vessels, the emission standard is very lenient. So it makes sense for countries like China or some Asian countries to start to tackle emissions technologies that can very quickly adopt it on on-road vehicles, on off-road vehicles. They can be retrofitted, and the fuel is more available also for on-road fleet as well. So I think that's probably a lower hanging fruit for Asian Pacific to adopt. Yeah.
That's great. And just one quick follow-up first, related to that. I think from the same questioner, the question came up: how can ports and the port authorities across the Pacific better collaborate to do promotion and help adopt some of the practices across the Pacific Ocean in some manner? We've heard a little bit about certain ports having more activity between them and sister ports. So any thoughts on collaborations that can help spur, exactly that kind of cross-Pacific best practices?
I'd like to come back to Kaohsiung frequently for this event. Perhaps we can do it twice a year, particularly when it's cold in Seattle, maybe. But I think this is a great start, and I understand there's a possibility of another event in this coming summer. However, I also think that we certainly all have access to electronic equipment, and we have tried even in the Pacific Northwest as we meet to use webinars more and use. It's not always the same. It's not the same as meeting face to face, but you can do it. So I would certainly like to see more collaboration and discussion between folks who have connected here about things that we could do together.
That's a great idea. I think all of us have strived to try and use video conferencing more often in webinars. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I guess low-lying fruit for communication purposes. It obviously costs a lot in time and resources to travel around the world, so I think we would all benefit from that kind of communication. So that's great. Let's see, I guess another question that comes up is, what additional research is needed globally to demonstrate the contributions mobile sources, and marine in particular, have to overall emissions? And specifically the questioner asks in China, in India, in U.S., and in other countries. So this is a good question. I guess I can take a first crack at this one. So additional research to better demonstrate contributions of marine sources. I think it's safe to say that within transportation, one of the poorest inventoried with the detailed assessment areas within transportation is the marine sector. We do have one effort at the ICCT to better understand what is the use of bunker fuel and the activities around the world, and what those contributions to fuel use and carbon dioxide could be. And we have an effort using satellite data, AIS data from 2011, using all ship movements around the world. And I have high hopes that we'll be able to estimate and help give us some better numbers on what is the true inventory, knowing that when most countries or regions do an inventory from fuel use and a carbon dioxide perspective, it would normally draw a control volume that does not include country-to-country maritime activity. So we have some efforts in that way to better bring on a global scale some numbers to the carbon dioxide inventory question. We've heard a little bit today from a couple folks on inventories related to marine sources in their contribution to NOx, PM, and sulfur dioxide. I think Frida mentioned in Hong Kong there's some inventory work there. The GIZ group that Frida mentioned that is working on ASEAN countries and their port activities did some new inventory work that got into the mobile source contribution of marine emissions in ports to the overall transport emissions. So I guess that's a couple thoughts. But the global research, I would say, definitely has to include better global activity data. Some of that is well held by different industry groups and is quite costly and requires a lot of analytical work from universities. But I know that that's just one idea. The ICCT is using satellite data to better apportion country-to-country activity marine-wise. Any other thoughts from anyone on the panel here to help us understand research to better understand marine sources of emissions? Okay. I guess I don't know if anyone in the audience who asked that question has further thoughts. Feel free to follow up afterwards, I guess. Let's see. Another question, and this one is for Dr. Yu. The question relates to the modeling, and the question is, how good is the predictability of ocean current modeling? Would the change in route be a risk to marine accidents? This in parentheses, could be a public safety concern.
Yeah. Yes, of course. The safety issue that I don't know, but I think they are well equipped with this anti-collision system, most of the ships. But for the model point of view, I think it's quite stable at this moment. I think we can do, within 3 days to a week forecast. I think that will be no problem. If we can really make use of that, I think at least 5 to 10% of the fuel can be saved. The shipping time can be saved. I don't know if this answering the question or.
Yeah, I think so. And I have one more that's just coming in here also for Dr. Yu. Yeah, thank you on that one. I guess that's exciting to think that there could be 5 or 10% improvements if the modeling could be shown to be robust and predictable over time. So that's great. So also for Dr. Yu, question, what are your plans to use this model? Does the model have the capability to model longer trans-Pacific routes and optimize those routes with respect to ocean currents?
That's a very difficult question. For trans-Pacific, I think because the model it depends on the weather, particularly. So weather forecast now, I think reliably within a week or so. Though 2 weeks weather forecast is already there, but mostly we use 3 to 7 days of forecast of weather. So within that region, I think we can be handled very well. But usually this kind of thing in our concept is that we will run based on your what you are going. So every day we can forward the position and directions following the current forecast. So that it's not something can be built on the ship so they can know, because we really rely on daily operation information. So that has to be based on our kind of calculation.
And thank you for that. Let's see. One more question, unrelated, but going back to an earlier set of slides within Stephanie's presentation, getting back to the carbon footprinting question. I think this is a fascinating area that I would have said maybe 5 years ago, a lot of folks in Europe and other parts of the world would think, oh, maybe there will be a comprehensive climate policy, and maybe that would spur more use of carbon footprinting in products we buy, or somehow carbon pricing would impact in some way goods that are available for and would be shipped around the world. I guess now it's harder to see any sort of comprehensive carbon policy coming into play anytime extremely soon. But I'm curious, right now, where might the drivers be? Who might be most interested in this idea of carbon footprinting? Are there certain shipping companies, or do you think it could be consumer-driven in the long term? I'm thinking of Europe especially. I think where in the United Kingdom there's much more work related to carbon footprinting and labeling of products. But maybe this one is best for Stephanie. You probably thought about this carbon footprinting issue with your Seattle study.
So we've seen some shippers, not shipping lines, but beneficial cargo owners, looking at their overall corporate carbon footprint and setting reduction goals. So this is not a widespread practice, but there are companies that are doing this. And so part of their reduction goals include their supply chain. So they are looking for reductions. They are not yet, so those are right now corporate goals that are kind of more, I guess, corporate social responsibility. What we haven't seen yet is a way to specifically market to the end user. So when I buy, for instance, coffee in the U.S., my coffee bag has about 13 different certifications: bird-friendly, rainforest-friendly, organic. I can't even think of what they all are. And so I could see a day when there is there is a shipped green certification. I think we're some way from that, but there certainly are, an influx of third-party certifiers. When we buy seafood, we have that in the U.S. But I think that's a couple years out. What I see as a driver in the shorter terms are companies that are setting their carbon footprint goals that include supply chain carbon footprint. Many of their goals don't include that, but there are some firms that are making broader goals, including supply chain. So that would be a more immediate driver.
That's a great point. I think we're all getting used to having many different labels on many of our food products, many of our consumer products of various types. So it doesn't seem like a stretch to imagine some sort of third-party certification system that would say something about and have some verification for the upstream elements, knowing that there are these corporate responsibility efforts in play. One example that comes to mind within the automobile companies is Ford Motor Company has a very detailed corporate responsibility plan within the next couple years to see in the manufacturing of their vehicles how much energy is happening upstream, to put in context the use of the vehicle through the lifetime, but also what happens in the manufacturing side. And I think at some point the rigor of all of the analysis behind all of the life cycle analysis in the upstream supply side, I think at some point, those numbers get better, and there will be more demand for those numbers. I think that's right.
The other thing I just want to add to that is, over the long run, lower carbon footprint should mean lower fuel cost, and it should mean lower cost. Now, today, the way ocean shipping is priced is not aligned with that at all. But as we get better numbers on it, it's also not hard to conceive that it might be.
Yep. Yep. Each carbon came from some fuel that costed some amount of money. So there should be a very direct relationship there. Yeah, especially in the long term. Let's see. I don't have any more questions from the audience. I have a couple more that I might be able to ask, but I wanted to offer up an opportunity for anyone from the audience to ask a question. It looks like Simon has a question. Maybe if we let Simon ask his question, that'd be great.
Thank you. Well, actually, it's not a question. I just want to add a little bit to the first question that's been put forward to the panelists and also to their response. When it comes to what are the most suitable control measures for Asian ports, I think we also have to think about what kind of pollutants we want to reduce, or greenhouse gases. Of course, as we compare different control measures, some of the measures will be more effective in cutting down a certain type of pollutant and the emissions of those. When it comes to fuel switching, for example, I totally agree that this is what I call a low-hanging fruit. It's been proven, it's been practiced in US and Europe, and also in some part of Asia. So this is the natural candidate for Asian ports to start with. But fuel switching would only bring about a substantial reduction in SO2 and also a fairly good amount of reduction of particulate. But when it comes to, say, nitrogen oxides, I don't think we can rely on using lots of fuel to cut emissions of NOx. We have to think about the engine performance, or even a tighter engine standards, so that we can reduce NOx. So I think when it comes to reducing ship emissions across the board, we cannot rely on just one measure. So that's my sense.
I think that's a great point, Simon. I think we found in the United States, among all the pollutants, oxides of nitrogen, NOx emissions, have been among the toughest to try and reduce. And it's different city by city, air basin by air basin, but generally speaking, even with new standards being adopted that lower the emissions of light-duty vehicles and heavy-duty vehicles, the NOx emissions reductions generally are not nearly as, do not bring those emissions nearly as low as we've gotten hydrocarbons, particulate matter, and essentially all the other conventional pollutants. NOx has been the toughest. So that's true. I think there are very few measures that very seriously get at NOx other than major vehicle standards, engine standards. NOx in particular relates to the engine and after treatment. So I think I agree with that point. I think NOx is the toughest one to get at in a lot of places, and it's always important, city by city, air basin by air basin, to look at what is the most important pollutant that is contributing to human health. And it tends to be different in a lot of different places.
I just want to add on to that, because that's an excellent point. It's not the same between each port, and the importance of doing an emissions inventory to understand that. I mean, what we found in the Pacific Northwest is our pie chart looks quite different than the pie chart in Southern California. So we can't just copy what they have done. We've needed to look closely at solutions that work for us, and even between the ports of Tacoma and Seattle, our operations are different. We've tended to have more trucking, and so we've needed to focus more on that. We've also had more community pressure on that, but so there is definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution by any means. It's really important to look at the specific situation in each port, their operations and their emissions.
And I agree, this is a very good point, Simon. And I think for Pearl River Delta, and also broadly for China, I think the loss emissions is one of the major pollutants that the Chinese government want to target because of the haze, the ozone issues that's associated with it. But I think in addition to emission standard for new vessels, I think there's a lot of discussion right now about scrappage of old vessels, because there's a legacy fleet that the emissions coming out from that would need to be addressed. And for China or from some developing countries where there's basically no emission standard right now for any vessels, I think maybe a more cost-effective way could be scrapping the vessels, or encouraging repowering or retrofitting the vessels, maybe repowering the vessels. But that needs to be looked into case by case to see what the fleet is like and how cost effective it is to retire them or repowering them. So I think that's a good point and need to be addressed as well.
Well, that's great. I think with that, we're at time, and I think we've had a great exchange here to add to all the great exchanges here for the last 2 days. I'd like to give a warm round of applause for our speakers here. I think you all did an excellent job. And I think we're good for break. Is there any announcements, Penny, that you'd like to make?
I would just say take the conversation outside again to the break. We have a half an hour this time, quite a bit of time. And please come back here at 3:30. 30 after the hour.